Lesia Ogryzko is a visiting fellow from the wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She leads a Ukrainian think tank on security and defense at the Sahaidachnyi Security Center and is a board member of Ukraine's biggest expert coalition on the country's reconstruction. Rise Ukraine. Previously, she served as international civil servant across the UN system, dealing with human rights and the coordination of UN agencies in Ukraine. Before we jump into the episode, thank you to everyone who supports the channel, especially by liking, subscribing, sharing these materials to help get them around and get more people to discover the amazing guests that come onto the channel. And of course, everybody who's bought me a coffee or joined Patreon, it really does help to keep the channel going. And of course, as we do with every episode, do check out the fundraiser we've got going for 4x4 vehicles, which are absolutely essential pieces of kit to help Ukrainians get to and from the front lines and indeed get evacuated when they're wounded. So please do check out our donations link in the description of the video. Lesia, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
The first question seems particularly relevant at the moment, and it was about how to explain the resilience of Ukrainian society in wartime. But you've just come from a night where one of the heaviest bombardments has taken place in Kiev, and it's also a period of the last couple of weeks which has seen the most intense and continuous bombardment. So this idea of resilience takes on, I think, a new and far more sort of vivid idea in the mind. How do you explain it?
Well, first of all, you're very right, Jonathan. The past few weeks or months in Ukraine have been particularly intense. The Russian strategy has changed a little bit, while they are trying now, I believe, to really target first and foremost civilians. We have seen moments during the full-scale invasion when they were targeting primarily energy facilities, then trying to target Ukrainian military sites. Now I think is the moment when they are really after the backbone of the society, really the society itself, and trying to break us, and trying to create this internal pressure from within on the Ukrainian government to I don't know, to start either the negotiations, but on terms that would be completely unfavorable for Ukraine, or just white the white flag. In terms of resilience and overall, I think one has to understand first and foremost that the Ukrainian society is very horizontal in its nature. It's very network centric, and that dates for many centuries back. Ukraine has had this bad luck of being part of the Russian Empire and then later of the Soviet Union for over 3 centuries, where Ukrainians have had to basically adjust to a situation when the authorities, the central authorities, the government is an organism that is trying basically to kill you, to erase your national identity, to forbid culture, language, to do mass deportations, etc., etc. One of the worst and tragic moment in Ukraine's history was during the Holodomors in Ukraine, the famine, the genocide against the Ukrainian nation, but also so many other things that have been going on over the last 300 years. So in a way, Ukrainians have learned to distrust the central authorities. And this is something that couldn't have changed overnight. And unfortunately, now, even more than 30 years after regaining Ukraine's independence, we still see that in the public polls. We see that in regular conversations between people, that there is this general distrust to central authority. Now, as a coping mechanism, while you are living in a condition where you don't have trust to the government, you develop those horizontal networks, horizontal communication between people. You tend to trust more the people around you, obviously the family, the friends, work colleagues, or just even in times of crisis, like that has been during the different revolutions in Ukraine, or especially after the full-scale invasion, where you just generally tend to trust people around you. And this is something that might be regarded as a weakness, but also as a strength of society. And I think especially in moments where in any country, the central authorities and the central government would not cope with such a huge tragedy, such a huge challenge like a beginning of a full-fledged war, I think it's really beneficial for Ukrainians that they can fall back on this particularity, this phenomenon of this resilience, where you count on yourself, you count on people around you, and you are not listening or not even expecting to receive some high orders or commands or guidelines from above. And I think this is definitely something where European societies can learn from Ukraine, because obviously in many Western countries, institutions function, right? They enjoy a lot of societal trust in them. But I think when such a crisis comes knocking on your door, it's actually not a bad idea to also be able to fall back on yourself and on other citizens. So I think this is the part of the resilience
Hmm.
that we're talking about, right?
A kind of radical decentralization, as it were, and exercise of agency and exercise of responsibility and problem solving. These are all things identified, certainly in the interviews. And there's a particular irony, isn't there? Without that radical decentralization, and indeed the sort of maybe mass awakening, political awakening that happened in Maidan or Revolution of Dignity, then perhaps that ability to coordinate, to resist, to survive, to hold off a full-scale invasion for now more than 3.5 years wouldn't have been possible. But equally, without Maidan, which many Ukrainians have told me they believe is the source of Putin's invasion, not NATO or biolabs or all the kind of nonsense, but it's the very fact that Ukraine has had a political awakening, a revolution, which Putin wanted to crush. I mean, that's the irony. It's both the savior and the trigger for the invasion. Do you think that's, a correct interpretation?
Well, I would definitely say that I wouldn't say that we have learned it during the Maidan times. We definitely have had it as part of our DNA, because as said, it's rooted historically for centuries back. But we have definitely had a good test run during the Maidan time, even during the Orange Revolution back in 2004. Um, Now, what you're saying is absolutely right when you look the at Putin's strategy and his incentives. Because I have seen so much nonsense around why Putin has invaded, like starting with the NATO discussion that it has been Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO that has provoked Putin to invade, and many other, or the European integration of Ukraine. What is actually at stake is essentially what you're saying. It is the moment when Ukrainians started understanding and very much signaling to the outer world, and obviously also to Russia, that they are not part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, that they are not part of their spheres of influence, that Ukrainians are a sovereign nation, want to pursue their own foreign policy, security and defense policy as they see fit, and as they see fit for their national interest. And this is the moment when Putin understands, okay, I'm probably going to lose this country. And in order for this not to happen, you first start an invasion and annexation of Crimea, then follows Donbass. And then seeing the reaction, or rather the absence of the reaction of many Western countries, um, you start to understand there might not be a very big pushback, even if you go full scale. And this is essentially what happens in 2022, when Putin feels very much emboldened by the absence of any deterrent from the Europeans or the Americans. And this is when he thinks, this is the moment I have to finalize the, let's say, the Ukraine project for myself.
So he feels a sort of window closing on that opportunity. I mean, it also suggests he feels a sense of ownership of Ukraine, a sense that it has no agency, it's not independent. We see that from his rhetoric. It's overtly imperialist rhetoric. And the violence has a genocidal character. So we have imperialism and genocide combined. We have the genocidal rhetoric that didn't just begin in 2022, didn't even just begin in 2014, but already, the Putin regime, even before that, was experimenting with, highly nationalist, racist narratives, and overtly starting to brainwash the population into being compliant with a potential, I would say, genocide of Ukraine. Given that the evidence for this is clear, given that, I think well-meaning people understand what Putin's motivations are and don't get distracted by all the sort of NATO nonsense about Russia being encircled. I mean, just have a look at a map and realize how big it is. If anything, it's Europe that is encircled by Russia and its allies. How do you explain, I won't say the indifference of international institutions, but the complete ineffectiveness to prevent Russian aggression? And people say, but Europe's given Ukraine a lot, and so's the US, etc. But we're 4 years into extraordinary aggression of an imperialist genocidal nature, and we have not done enough to stop Russia. And indeed, a recent study showed that in combination, European countries have spent more on Russian hydrocarbons than they've actually given to Ukraine to enable it to survive.
Well, I think there are a couple of points here. One is that I think the West, or I would rather say Europe and the US, because one might argue that the term the collective West does not exist any longer. Europeans and Americans have for many years not have this threat perception that Ukrainians and some of the eastern flank NATO countries had. And I think this is one of the reasons why there is not um, such a strong pushback from those countries. Um, I think the difference here is really between the Baltic countries, the Nordic countries, Poland, and some other Central Eastern European countries, and the rest of Europe, and obviously the United States, etc. This has absolutely plausible explanations due to the history of those countries, due to the subjugation of those countries during the past 300 years, just like Ukraine, when those countries have undergone Russification, have undergone again the forbidding of their cultures and language, mass deportation, migration, etc., etc. Um, Unfortunately, this message has not been successful in being transferred and mainstreamed throughout the other European countries and going forward into the transatlantic dimension. So I think this is one of the reasons why there is not so much in an understanding. The other is that Europeans, and again, I would rather say those others that don't have the same threat perception as Ukraine, for example, are lacking the sense of urgency. very often when I'm speaking with my fellow think tankers in various countries, with politicians, not so much with military personnel though, is that that they're saying, but we still have time. And this is one of the mantras that I keep hearing, especially the past couple of months, actually, that Europeans are starting to be thankful to Ukrainians because they are sort of buying time for them. But the mistake that many in Europe do is that they think they have 5 to 8 years, because this is one of those things that I keep on hearing, is that European military industrial base needs another 5 or 8 years to to really come up with a strong deterrent against any aggressor, including Russia, etc. But the mistake is that why do you think Putin will be giving you this time? Why do you think Putin will be waiting for those 5 to 8 years? Wait until you're ready. Wait until you have closed the gaps of all of those military capabilities and industrial capabilities that you don't have. Now actually is the right moment, because Trump has, I think, done a very, if you can say a positive thing, but in terms of, switching on and waking up the Europeans, is to making them understand that Article 5 might not be there for them, that the Americans might not take and pick up their phone once there is an invasion, let's say in the Baltic states, etc. So I think with those changes in the US administration, the second problem that I'm talking about the sense of urgency, is beginning to be addressed. But at the same time, I must say, still many European counterparts that I speak to do believe that they have the time, and do believe that Ukrainians will miraculously hold the line for another 5 to 8 years, because we have all the manpower of this world, which is unfortunately not true. And this is a calculation that might be very costly, not just for Ukraine, but for many in Europe.
That's extraordinary because, I mean, do they talk to anybody? Because, just making, short trips to Ukraine this year, and especially in Donbass, talking to some people near the front, it's you're painfully aware of the high price this is exacting. So on the first hand, it is morally reprehensible to be grateful to Ukrainians and yet do nothing to really save their lives. It's disgusting in many ways, but also it's extremely delusional, because it's quite clear in talking to people on the front that it's the incredible innovation and advance of drone technology that Ukraine has been able to achieve, is very consciously being done because the shortages in manpower and experienced fighters are blatant to everyone. So this innovation isn't just something like, oh, well done, Ukrainians, aren't they clever? It's an absolute survival strategy, and it's done fully conscious with that in mind. How on earth is not just this sort of political delusion that Ukrainian resources are infinite get into European heads? How can that even be squared morally?
How this can be squared
Sort of
morally?
just justified morally, yeah.
Uh, well, I must say, of course, Ukrainians are very often frustrated when we are seeing this lack of urgency, this mentality that they have so many years, and that Ukrainians will keep fighting with the little support that they are receiving. And don't get me wrong, we receive actually a lot of support from certain countries, especially if you calculate it then to their GDP. You see the headliners. Obviously, it's the NBA, the Nordic Baltic countries that are the frontliners here. But at the same time, um, if you look at the Ukrainian society over the past 10, 15 years, and how Ukrainians have also very often turned a blind eye on so many other international conflicts that have been going on, uh, um, you've really, or even if you're looking at the time span between 2014 when the war started and 2022. Um, when the full-scale invasion started, you would also see an unfortunate phenomenon in the Ukrainian society where quite a large number of different groups in Ukrainian society were sort of living in a parallel reality and not seeing a war in their own country. So, to a certain degree, of course, we in Ukraine are now waving this red flag uh, as strongly and as vividly as we can because our house is on fire, and it's not just like in a one corner like it's been since 2014, but it's actually the whole house. Um, but at the same time, we also understand it's difficult to mentally and psychologically process this unless you've actually experienced this. It's really difficult to for everyone in Ukraine when we are talking with international partners, with our friends about, let's say, ballistic missile attacks. It's really difficult to explain to a person what it is when you're looking at your phone and you see that you see this message that a ballistic missile is heading towards Kiev, and you don't have the time to run to a shelter because you don't necessarily have a bomb shelter right in beneath well in the parking lot, let's say, or an actual bomb shelter of your building, but you have to run to the metro, which, let's say, takes 5 minutes. And you understand if a ballistic missile is heading towards your town, you don't have this luxury of 5 minutes. So essentially, you just you stay where you are and you just pray to God. And it's really difficult to explain what this 1 minute, what psychological processes and what different thoughts you think during, which happens actually during night, which is even more scary because it's, it's nighttime. Uh, so it's really difficult to explain to anyone who didn't have this experience what it is, or how you react to explosions, and how you react to this sound, this terrible sound of Shahed drones, which are not very fast, and that's why you hear the sound for quite a long time, and you don't know whether it will pass your building or it will actually hit your building. But this is something you cannot explain to anyone externally unless they have had this experience. So from one perspective, of course, Ukrainians are trying to deliver this message and say, look how difficult, what a tremendously difficult time we're undergoing, and this is what can expect you if you will not be decisive enough, if you will not impose deadly sanctions on Russia, if you will not stop Putin here. But on the other side, just from a human perspective, we understand that it's difficult to start living in this mentality if rockets are not flying over your heads.
And let's tie two of those topics together. One, Russia's intent to commit extreme violence, and indeed, unfortunately, its capability to do so, and European preparedness. Because, having been in Ukraine, I've never actually experienced a sort of energy cut, which is remarkable. Given that I've been to Ukraine 5 times and spent, a considerable amount of time there. Just the idea of being able to keep the lights on, being able to keep the heat on, being able to keep sort of food flowing and the shops stocked is incredible. I fear that actually Russia's new technique of outsourcing the activities of what the sort of SVR agents or GRU agents would have done previously, outsourcing it to criminals, outsourcing it to, you know, desperate young people, outsourcing it to migrants and others. This is a technique they are testing quite clearly throughout Europe. They've been testing it. I mean, a court case was completed in the UK, which got almost no attention, unfortunately, where a bunch of petty criminals burnt down warehouses of businesses that were supporting Ukraine at the direction of the Russian intelligence services. It seems to me that if they really, in the event of a direct confrontation with Russia, they could cause absolute mayhem and chaos on the European continent, and we're barely prepared for that.
Well, I very much agree. It's this, again, it's a mentality shift that needs to finally happen. Some leaders in Europe and some societies have understood this, some don't. But the fact is that Russia is waging war against Europe for many years now. This is nothing that a politician would want to admit, because then all of those questions from his or her society start to pop up while the government is not prepared, while the government is not taking decisive actions, etc. But this is a message that Ukrainians have been shouting out loud for many, many years, at least since 2014, that Russia is indeed the mastermind behind any hybrid attacks and hybrid warfare. Look at um, the Gerasimov paradigm and doctrine that really lays out how you can erode a country, a society from within, not even using any bullets or any tanks, but you can do it through a whole toolbox of different instruments, let's say like sabotage, like individual killings of certain key persons in a society, like interference in elections that we have seen so many times now that I will not go into details. Look at the massive disinformation campaigns that are not just about, spreading fake news. And this is something that many people are mistaken about, that it's just about you received a wrong piece of information. Well, it's not. It's about eroding the social fabric of a country when they pick up the stories and the themes in a society that are particularly heated, that really have the potential of dividing a population. And this is when they're targeting their disinformation campaigns, etc. The financing of radical parties across the European continent. And I can go on and go on. These are just examples of this toolbox that Russia has when it comes to eroding European societies. And unfortunately, European institutions and individual countries have not yet come up with a comprehensive and robust strategy how to counteract it. Look, for example, at the most recent examples that have been exacerbated over the last couple of months, and that is the underwater and undersea connections. Europe is extremely vulnerable. It is a continent with the highest number of undersea connections in the world. And the Baltic Sea, by the way, holds a strategic importance because it hosts the vast majority of those European sea cables and key energy pipelines. And you see that there hasn't been a very robust response to that, although this is a threat not just to one individual country, but it's actually a threat to the whole of the continent. And you see that European institutions or NATO command has not been able to really respond with an actual deterrent. They are investing into surveillance, which is great, of course, but you also need to have an actual deterrent against these things because, again, something that Ukrainians have been saying for many, many years, that the only language that Putin understands is the language of power. And Putin, as well as his friends from the autocratic bloc, the so-called axis of evil, are also very closely watching what the response is from the Western world to different hybrid attacks and even actual attacks, because apart from the undersea connections, you also had multiple violations over the past year of the airspace of NATO countries. And again, there has been no actual response from those individual countries or from NATO as a bloc. So all of this is just a probing. I mean, the hybrid attacks or a combination of hybrid and actual kinetic are all testing grounds for Putin to do to make the next step. And the next step is unfortunately to actually invade yet another country except for Ukraine.
And I did an episode earlier in the week. Um, when you look at, say, the role of China, I don't want to go too broad here, but when you look at the role of China in not just tolerating its vassals and proxies like North Korea and Russia, which has essentially become a vassal of China at this point, an economic dependent, and a dependent for military components. Then China's role is far more pernicious here. It's not simply tolerating this, but it is quite possible that what Russia is doing very much suits China's foreign policy. In fact, their deputy foreign minister came out in Europe and in a closed session with Kaja Kallas basically admitted that they don't want Russia to lose. He didn't say he wanted them to win, but not to lose. I mean, this is extraordinary. You used the phrase, and that was going to be my next question, was about sort of shallow seas and grey fleets. And you've certainly covered off, half of that question about the extreme vulnerability here. But the other side of that is the grey fleet. We are essentially still providing Russia directly with revenue and indirectly with components and resources that allows its military machine to keep going. And we're not putting pressure on the secondary countries like India and China, which are absolutely critical. Without their assistance, I think Russia's regime would fold, or at least it wouldn't be able to sustain the war. At what point do we get serious and close these loopholes? I mean, another critical crunch point is coming later this month, where the Russian frozen central bank assets need to be rolled over once again and as part of a six-monthly program. That is in doubt. I mean, if these funds seed back to Russia, we are basically providing Russia with the rope to hang us with.
I very much agree with you. Just to continue on the Baltic front, um, the Achilles heel of Putin's regime currently lies in the revenue that is derived from energy exports. Now, since 2022, the ratio between gas and oil has changed, and now 70% of Russia's energy exports amounts to oil exports. So oil has since 2022 now increased in the significance for Russia's economy and for Russia's revenue. Why the Baltic Sea is so strategic is because out of all of the oil exports of Russia, the Baltic Sea routes amounts to 60% of those. The other 30 and then the rest is through the Black Sea, but 60% is more than half is through one sea, the Baltic Sea, that since 2023 is essentially an internal NATO lake. And this is something that strikes Ukrainians the most, I guess, is when you have a sea essentially to yourself and you still don't apply the necessary sanctions and the necessary measures to actually make this money flow that finances the war stop. What the Western countries have done so far is that they applied the so-called price cap. Now, from our perspective, again, given the fact that the Baltic Sea is a NATO sea, essentially, I think a paradigm shift has to happen where you don't apply the price cap, but you actually limit the physical ability for the export. And this is quite easily done if certain countries in the Baltic Sea region and backed by European institution would essentially take that measure. So this is number one because the oil money is the number one source for the Russian war machine that is actually killing Ukrainian children and destroying the whole country. Number two, very much agree with you about the secondary sanctions, and this is why Ukraine is trying to exert pressure, although this is almost impossible with this current US administration, but we have a lot of friends who are doing that with us, is to really convince the US leadership to apply this sanction bill that is currently in the Senate. And we very much hope that it will get passed, because this is when we essentially address this question you had about China, about India, and all of the other countries that are basically circumventing those sanctions and supporting the Russian war machine. And the third, again, very much agree with you on the Russian frozen assets. We have almost 300 billion USD in mostly in European countries. More than half of that is in Euroclear, which is a financial institution in Belgium. And that's why we, again, together with some of our partners in the European Union, are trying to convince finally some of the European countries, including Belgium, France, Italy, and Germany, that there is a legal case for that. And it really takes just political will to solve this matter, because those 300 billion US dollars can be used for the purpose of arming Ukraine, rearming Ukraine, so channeling this money into the defense industrial base of Ukraine. It can also be a good source for Ukraine's reconstruction, but it can also be a good source for paying and repaying repatriation for the victims of the war. So all of these measures, the frozen assets, the deadly sanctions, the oil export, and also, by the way, the financial banking system, especially in Russia, which is so far sanctioned only to a third. So there are 300 banks in Russia, only 100 are subject to financial international sanctions. So these four critical moments are could be a reason enough for Putin to feel cornered and to feel compelled to actually sit at the negotiation table. Because as for now, the I don't see any prospects in a ceasefire, or not to mention even a peace process, unless Putin thinks that he's winning the war and he can afford it in terms of finance, in terms of manpower, and in terms of industry.
That's it. And he may be getting delusional information, false information from within his system, giving him cause to overestimate his capabilities in that line. And there's almost nobody who will speak truth to power. Even at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, a few people started to break cover and, squeal a little bit about the state of things. But it seems ironic that the war criminal Gherkin is the only person who is openly saying, that this is going to fail. But of course, he's only saying it because he would like the war to be successful and Russia to be victorious. But nonetheless, I think some of his analysis is quite interesting. And the very last thing, because I know we're approaching the end, Russia's not going to go away, but it seems that all Western powers just hope that it would, not physically, but it's like they're sticking their heads in the sand. If we really embrace the idea that Russia geographically will not disappear, would we not have a more robust plan to deal with it? It's as if it's this sort of invisible thing just out of the corner of your eye, which you don't really want to think too much about. How do we get Europeans, and I include Britain in that, to really come up with an idea of what what kind of Russia we can tolerate in future, or how we can contain it if it doesn't fulfill, the aspirations we have for it, um, rather than trying to pretend the problem isn't there.
My think tank, the Sahaidachnyi Security Center, has recently published a report. I actually have it here. It's called Russia 2032 Scenarios. A decade post full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's why we took 2032. Perspectives from a neighbor who knows too well. So perspectives from Ukraine, and this is a report that has been conducted by a number of think tanks under the leadership of the Sahaidachnyi Security Center. And this is essentially an attempt to take out the crystal ball and to look at the various scenarios and the different future trajectories of Russia's development. Of course, there are so many different variables from the external factors into the internal ones that you can come up with, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 different scenarios. And then what we decided to do is to group them into larger trajectories of Russia's future. And we have distilled them essentially to four. And one is a very strong totalitarian Russia under almost no sanctions or complete lift of sanctions, where Russia transforms into a military superpower that definitely can threaten most of European countries, if not all, and really erode the NATO bloc from within. There is a second one, which is a called the weak totalitarian Russia. So while the first one is sort of Russia turning into a North Korea, but on steroids, here it's a rather weak, not a superpower, but the regional superpower, but can, however, still be a very major regional disruptor, especially if the US complete their pivot to China and into the Indo-Pacific, and Russia can indeed also meddle into European affairs quite effectively. There is one, the third one, which is called the democratization, however, with a catch. And this is unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the scenario that European countries and many in the US see as the most favorable and the most likely. Now, we believe when it comes to likelihood, this is most probably the least likely scenario, because if you look at historical precedents, there is basically no historical precedents of any form of democratic governance whatsoever. But why we're saying that this scenario is with a catch is because we are not sure that a Russia with more or less fair and free elections, with functioning, with a good functioning, a good governance system, transparency and lack of corruption, would indeed transform into a peace-loving country. Because what still would be there is essentially what you have just mentioned: is this mentality of an imperialist that really wants to conquer and to increase the territory and the spheres of influence. As the Russians say, where are the borders? There are no borders of Russia. So in a way, this fairy tale about a democratic Russia does not serve a good service to those people in those countries who believe in that. And the fourth scenario is the one that is mostly feared by Western countries. Very often when we even start talking about the possibility of it, because we're just talking about, the likelihood, there might be different scenarios. When we even start to mention this fourth scenario, which is a collapse or disintegration of this huge territory, which has almost 200 nations and peoples in this so-called federation, although it's definitely not a federation if you look at it from a legalistic point of view, that this territory can at some point dissolve or disintegrate. This is the one when this is the time when many our interlocutors start to think that we are absolutely crazy, as if there was no 1991, where a huge Soviet bloc all of a sudden also erupted. And this is a scenario where we are saying, and actually to all of those four scenarios, the one message that we are trying to convey with this report is look at every scenario and consider the advantages and disadvantages. And the way how we are now, especially the US administration, but some in the European countries are approaching Russia is more or less heating up the first scenario when we are essentially letting Russia rearm completely and turn into a huge military disruptor of not just European security but global security. And consider this against the fourth one, which everybody fears because the so-called nuclear proliferation, although this can be addressed, and perhaps we can discuss it at another episode of your podcast. So look at the pros and cons, and you might actually see that the one that you're fearing most is not the worst if you're looking into a 10 or 15 years perspective. And just be prepared to any scenario and do your homework and think of a contingency strategy for all of them, because essentially it's not about you being able to decide the future, but you being able to prepare for it and not be taken aback like you were in 1991 and repeat sometimes in 2020 something or 30 something the chicken speech and try to address the peoples of Russia that they should not break away from Moscow, for example.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have to end there. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I would absolutely love to record another episode. I will try to get my hands on the Russia 2032 report. I think that would be a prerequisite for me to sort of read that prior to our next episode and to share some insights from that with the audience. For today, though, I know you have to rush. It's been a huge pleasure speaking to you, Lesia, and I think the audience will be very grateful for your insights and the work that you and your colleagues do.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for everything you do for Ukraine, Jonathan.